Hi, I'm Dr. Gwyn Erwin, and welcome back to Healing for Your Life. Today we're going to be talking about trauma, what it is, and why it stays unresolved. This is a foundation of all the videos to come. So first we're going to talk about 4 kinds of trauma. The first is acute trauma, which is sudden and severe and frightening or overwhelming experience. The next is repeated acute trauma, which is a number or a series of event traumas that are terrifying and overwhelming. The next is cumulative trauma. Cumulative trauma means that something happens repeatedly that is traumatic within a relationship. So it's daily life trauma that adds up. And last, vicarious trauma is witnessing a trauma of someone else's where you are helpless to intervene or to stop it. So those are the 4 kinds of trauma. Now, there may be people who describe them other ways, but this is my description that comes out of my research and out of my clinical experience. The critical element that makes an event traumatic is the person's inner experience of that outer event, its meaning to them. So if a child is neglected, they are going to feel that the parents do not value them, that they're not worthwhile, that they are not important, that they don't matter. If a child is abused, they may believe that it's all their fault. If the child is deprived, they may feel that they're a burden. So there is a subjective quality to what trauma means to an individual, and that determines a lot of its effect upon that person. Now, some of the effects of trauma are what we call immobilization. This is a very early defense. It happens between the ages of birth and about 2.5 years old. We also call it freezing. And when this occurs, the victim gives up. They pretend that they're dead. They pretend that it doesn't matter. They just let it happen because they aren't old enough yet to flee or to fight back. Now, you can still get immobilized as an adult because that's one of our 3 biological defenses. And some of us haven't progressed beyond that. We're kind of professional hiders. We just don't know, how to get out of a situation, or we become very passive in the light of conflict or trauma. Another response to trauma is to flee. Now, this defense, this natural biological defense, cannot really occur much before the age of 2.5, because the child has to be aware that there is some place to go, that there's a rudimentary sense of time that they can get there, and that there is indeed some place to hide. So between the ages of 2.5 on up, fleeing becomes our second biological defense. Our third biological defense of confronting or fighting back doesn't really successfully occur until our adolescence, when we are old enough to have the physical strength to fight back. To say to an abusive parent, you do that to my mother one more time, or you do that to my sister one more time, and I'm going to deck you. That's usually when physical abuse or sexual abuse might be able to be stopped. Now, that doesn't mean that children don't fight back earlier. It just means that they're not successful at it because they're not strong enough. But they can be successful enough, at least temporarily, because they have enough mobility and they have that rudimentary sense of time and a place to hide to run away. And always they can just give up and become immobile. So these are our 3 biological defenses. And they're the defenses we can employ when we are feeling traumatized. Now, they're not always successful. So sometimes we become hyper-aroused. We might get frantic, we might spin, we might shout, we might sob, we might dash against something. Or we can dissociate, which is a psychological defense to split off the experience so that we don't feel its effects. Lots of time you'll hear people who have been traumatized say, "I left my body." This is often true for sexual victims who have been abused because they have no place to go. And so they exit their minds. They exit the experience through this incredible mechanism of the mind that it is capable of doing. Another result of trauma is that it makes it very difficult sometimes to decipher stimuli. Something can feel traumatic when it's not, meaning that it becomes overdetermined. It becomes a larger experience than it actually is, but because of previous experience, somebody is easily triggered, and they react to a current stimuli as though trauma is actually occurring, when indeed it might not be. Another thing that happens for people who have been traumatized is that it's very difficult to what we call regulate your own reactions, your physical sensations, your emotional feelings, your belief systems about something. So a traumatic event occurs and somebody feels that they deserve it, or they feel they deserve to be punished, or their hearts are racing and their mouths are dry and their temperature is going up, or they get freezing cold, or they get very, very frightened, or they get paralyzed and immobile, and they're not able to change those feelings. They're just swamped in them. And those effects can last sometimes for minutes or hours or days. And as trauma recurs, or as the stimuli and triggers of trauma reoccurs, those same physical and emotional and mental responses can be triggered as well. So when our responses to trauma continue over time, and the consequences to that trauma continues over time, we are now dealing with unresolved trauma. What makes trauma unresolved? Because this is what is the biggest problem for trauma victims. Most people, if a trauma event has a beginning and a middle and an end, they are able at some point to adapt to the experience for better or worse, and hopefully continue on with their lives. Not as though it never happened. They're changed by it. They're changed by it for good. But they're able to adapt and enter new experience again, or return to their jobs, or maintain their relationships. But for many people, this trauma does not get resolved. Why is that? Well, the first reason is that in the original experience, there was not a caring and responsible adult who could help the child or the person, the adolescent or young adult or adult, process their experience. There was nobody there to listen to them, talk it out as many times as they needed to. There was nobody there to ask them good listening questions like, well, what happened next? And how did that make you feel? And you know that wasn't your fault. And being an empathic and compassionate listener, as well as a processor, is indispensable to a victim of trauma. So the first reason the trauma does not get resolved is because there were not any people like that in the person's life. Even either a parent, or a teacher, or a spouse, or a friend. They were left to deal with the experience on their own. The second reason that a trauma can remain unresolved is that the very perpetrator of the trauma, and this is especially true in cumulative trauma, that is event or daily life, that is acute or daily life, is someone who's supposed to be a caring other. It could be a parent, it could be an uncle, but it's perpetrated by somebody who is supposed to be trustworthy and who betrays that child or adolescent or adult by perpetrating trauma on them instead of being the safe island that they're supposed to be. The third reason that trauma remains unresolved is that no protective or responsible caring adult is there to intervene in its repetition. Again, this is especially true in cumulative trauma that happens woven in and out of our daily lives, in our relationships. When the trauma does not cease or it gets repeated, neuronal pathways that were originally created by the initiating trauma, that is intense, has duration, now is repeated, and that neuronal pathway in the brain gets wired even more deeply and even more profoundly. With those repetitions, then the next time the trauma occurs, the individual's reaction is going to be more intense. It's front-loaded for them. And eventually, 30 years down the line, when even a whiff of that trauma might occur, that individual is going to respond with the same intensity that they had to the original trauma. That is trauma that is unresolved. The fourth reason that trauma remains unresolved is that the perpetrator of the trauma is not held accountable, nor do they have to make repairs or remedies or reparations, and they might even be more protected than the victim themselves. And lastly, the final reason that trauma remains unresolved is that the individual who is being traumatized is caught in a situation that Mary Maines, a wonderful attachment researcher, called fright without solution. There is no place for the child or young adult to go, and so they are overwhelmed by the experience. Then you loop around to our beginning reasons, and there's no one there to process it. The perpetrator may be someone who's supposed to be a caring adult. There's no one to intervene in its repetition, and the perpetrator is allowed to continue abusing that child or young adult. What happens with unresolved trauma in extended ways? It disrupts a person's very sense of self. It disrupts who they think they are, what their value is, how they move around in their world. They lose confidence, they feel self-conscious, they feel profound levels of shame and fear. They feel inadequate, they feel incapable, and even if they are successful and very high functioning, which many trauma victims are, they feel like a fraud, because internally they live in a minefield that gets set off by seemingly meaningless things. But those meaningless things are triggers of originating trauma that is still active. It also creates a sense of, instead of a person being able to kind of flow through their day in a sense of kind of going on being, as Winnicott would call it, they feel overwhelmed, and so different parts of them sort of become experts in handling certain things. They may have a part of themselves that can get very angry and confront, but not be effective because they're alienating people as the result. They may be a person who develops a fear disorder, and they go through their day and they're functioning just fine. Suddenly there's a whiff, there's a trigger, and they're terrified. And all they want to do is either become immobile or flee. They may develop an area of themselves that's very creative, but because their imagination has gotten appropriated for problem solving and fear anticipation of more trauma, their imaginations have a great deal of difficulty taking flight, even after moments of inspiration. So there are many, many, many responses to trauma. We're just at the tip of the iceberg. So I hope that this beginning profile of what trauma is and why it remains unresolved will help you understand your own or a loved one's experience. And now we're going to begin our journey at working with this and seeing what we can do now in current time to resolve our traumatic experiences. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to our next time together. Bye.